last week, there was also the AfDB, that's African Development Bank Group meeting, and they launched the report, the African Trade Report. So let's get into that and some of the issues as it affects not just Nigeria, but Africa, as you know, the African Development Bank. With the chief economist of the AfDB, Professor Kevin Urama, joins us from Brazil, where he's attending another meeting. Professor Urama, good morning.
Good morning.
So what time is it in Brazil? And tell us a little bit about the meeting you were there for.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. In Brazil, we are having G20 meetings on the International Financial Architecture Working Group, looking specifically on how to reform the global financial architecture to make it more inclusive, more nimble, and to be able to make more resources available for development in developing countries. Thank you.
So, Prof, very interesting. I mean, you saw Afrexim is having theirs is ending today. You had yours, AfDB, I think it was last week, and then you have this. So where do all of these meet? Because sometimes it seems we're just having all the meetings, interesting talks, great ideas, but where do they meet on the continent?
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm very personally excited with what the changes we're seeing in the global discourse around development. Last week, we had our African Economic Outlook report launched at the annual meetings of the African Development Bank Group in Nairobi, Kenya. And that report focused on driving Africa's transformation within the reform of the global financial architecture. The reasons being very clear that the global financial architecture evolved in the post-Second World War era when several of the African sovereign nations were not there around the table. And despite the fact that this architecture has supported growth, alleviated poverty, it has also created inequalities and created a number of challenges that currently the whole global community is now beginning to look at how can we refine it to make it better so that resources can be made more available for the things we need. You remember in 2022, we looked at mobilizing private sector financing for climate and green growth. And we did find that even the climate financial architecture is totally misaligned with climate vulnerability, meaning that countries that are more vulnerable to climate change are less likely to receive the climate finance to support their transitions. And in this report, we also looked at the structural transformation on the continent. Despite all the billions of dollars that has been invested domestically and also by the global community in supporting growth on the continent, we find that transformation in terms of structural transformation, meaning reallocation of labor from low productivity agriculture to higher productivity manufacturing sectors, is not happening that fast on the continent. While that transformation is happening, we find that we are still moving labor from lower productivity agriculture to other lower productivity sectors. So the growth in the manufacturing sector, productivity growth is only about 0.6% on the continent. And that is why, despite the figures on real GDP growth we have been reporting, showing that the continent has been resilient, growing faster than every other region except Asia, maintaining its second position as the second fastest growing economy, and also over 10 of Africa's countries being among the 20 fastest growing economies in 2024, we are still seeing increasing poverty, increasing insecurity, increasing inequalities, heightening inflation, debt vulnerabilities, and several challenges, which tells us that growing the economy is not good enough because we can't eat GDP. We need to be able to distribute the benefits of growth to reach the population. And that is part of what we're also discussing within the global financial architecture, how to ensure that there's equitable sharing of global resources to allow for development to happen across the developing world as well. Thank you.
So another thing that the report also captured is the issue of depreciating currencies, which seems to be common on the continent. I mean, in Nigeria, we see the numbers every day. Is there a solution that the AfDB has been able to suggest that can help the continent in this area?
Yeah, thank you very much. In terms of currency depreciation and also inflation, several fundamentals of the global in the macroeconomic sphere has not been going very well in Africa, but not just in Nigeria. We have seen depreciation of currencies in several countries of the continent. Over 30 countries in Africa saw depreciations in their currencies. But this is really very clear because there's a lot of imported inflation that is happening on the continent because of fiscal tightening post-COVID-19 in the advanced economies with whom we trade. So when the dollar is appreciating, we're going to be expecting that the local currencies in different countries often also depreciate, and also expect that to see that the cost of debt goes up because the interest rate countries have to pay for the debt they have borrowed keeps going up. But in Nigeria specifically, as you mentioned, we've seen a significant depreciation in the naira because of several reform policies that has been implemented in order to do some corrections in the currency market in the country. And such depreciations are normal. We do see that it does happen, but with right policies that are implemented in order to bolster that effect on the real economy and also structural reforms in the economy, we can then expect that in the medium to long term, things will get better.
So I guess that brings me to this question, that how do we find a balance, this necessary harsh reforms, and because it is for the long term, and keeping the people alive until the benefits of the reforms come to life?
Yeah, thank you very much. It is very clear that when you have structural reforms in order to do some policy corrections in the economies, it needs to be matched with also fiscal policy reforms and interventions to bolster the impacts of these reforms on the most vulnerable populations. We call them normally shock therapies. So we see that in Nigeria, for example, the country has done quite a lot in order to try and address the short-term impacts of these reforms that are happening. We're seeing interest rates being raised by the central bank. This is normally the classical approach to try and rein in inflation. But then in doing that, there is need to also carefully measure its impacts on SMEs and then impacts because when lending rates increase, you will expect that the SMEs will borrow less, and then there will be more challenges with regards to also access to capital by the poor. And that is why the government has done quite a lot in trying to address the challenges in the short term. So we've seen a lot of exchange rate pressures being addressed by the country through the policies that the central bank is implementing, but also through cash transfer measures and other measures that the country has been implementing to address the short-term challenges. Now, but in doing that, we also need to focus on structural reforms to help grow productivity in key sectors, because part of the impacts, the transmission effects of these changes in countries normally go through two major sectors. One is the energy sector, because in Nigeria, for example, where there's also the removal of subsidies, you are going to see that the price of petrol will go up and cost of transport will go up. So we also need to ensure that in doing that, we are trying to address the challenges that causes with regard to food price inflation and energy price inflation. And in Africa, it's not just about interest rates, because some of the challenges we have are also external, as I've mentioned, imported inflation because of fiscal consolidation in other countries with whom we trade. And then the dependency of our debt on dollars means also that interest rate, which means the fiscal challenges for the countries, will increase. So in addressing that, we also need to marry that with fiscal policies and investing in growth-enhancing sectors so that in the medium term, we can produce more food and be able to generate more electricity and reduce the cost of these on the poor. So why the shock therapies are important, they are short-term. So we need to also look for the medium-term policies that will help to address the systemic challenges within the fundamentals of the economy as we go forward.
Then the report also looked at productive infrastructure, investing in productive infrastructure. Where is Nigeria in this?
Nigeria, like many other African countries, has been investing in productive infrastructure, but there's quite a lot of challenges in accessing the necessary capital to invest at scale to be able to reach levels that drives productivity higher on the continent. And that is why the report looked at the policies that we need in order to drive that structural reform in the continent. I can give you the specific numbers with which, for how much Nigeria has invested or not invested. But we know that in Africa, we have an investment gap of over $180 billion US for physical infrastructure alone. But in our study, we find out that the continent needs over $402.2 billion US in additional financing to be able to address these infrastructure gaps in energy, in technology enhancing production, in services, in manufacturing, and other things. But the point I really need to make here is there's always a critical mass of capital that is required to be able to move economies from low production to higher production sectors. And that is why, if you read the report, we focus a lot on how to mobilize domestic revenue in order to ensure that we have enough resources within the continent to address that, but not by increasing tax rates. It's more about improving efficiency in the tax collection and making sure that those who are supposed to be paying the taxes are paying the taxes, improving tax compliance by enhancing the social contract with citizens, by ensuring that governments actually use those taxes to deliver public services. And that is why in our earlier interview, I talked to you about our public service delivery index to be measuring how countries are delivering on that delivery of public services. Because we see around the world that countries where there's a lot of efficient use of tax resources and also non-tax resources, citizens are able to pay taxes and are happy to mobilize more resources for governments to do more of the infrastructure. Yeah. But we also need non-tax resources from our natural resources. We know that in Africa, we have significant amounts of natural resources that are not really being fully deployed because we mostly export them as raw commodities with low value addition. So we also need to invest in value addition to ensure that we beneficiate our natural resources so that we can mobilize export revenues more than when we sell them as raw commodities.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. And I'm so happy you didn't talk about getting more loans because, I mean, debt servicing is also a burden on lots of countries on the continent. Thank you so much for your time and wish you the best in your deliberations right there in Brazil. Professor Kevin Urama, Chief Economist with AfDB.
Thank you very much for having me.